The Trilluminate Defense Academy didn't accept failures. Not in its systems, not in its instructors, and certainly not in the biometric scanners that had processed exactly 47,612 recruits across 19 species without a single malfunction. Until today, .recruit designation T247 stood in the scanning chamber with the kind of patience that came from waiting in too many government facilities. She was human, a recent addition to the Syndicate's military enrollment after Earth's provisional membership had been finalized 8 months prior. The scanner hummed, a pleasant crystalline sound that typically preceded a cheerful chime and an automatic door release. Instead, the hum climbed into a shriek. Red light flooded the chamber. Blast doors slammed down across 3 corridors simultaneously. The pleasant sound became a grinding wail that suggested expensive machinery eating itself from the inside. Well, T247 said to nobody in particular, "That's new." In the observation tower, Senior Coordinator Val pressed all 6 of his primary manipulators against the monitoring console, his crest flattening in profound confusion. "Impossible. The system doesn't lock down. It categorizes and assigns. It just locked down," his assistant pointed out. "I have optical sensors. I'm aware." Val's secondary manipulators fluttered in agitation. "Pull the diagnostic report." The assistant's claws clacked across the interface. Biometric scan completed successfully. Physiological markers recorded. Threat assessment calculated. Assignment protocol initiated. She paused. Then it triggered isolation protocol. "Isolation protocol?" Val's crest shot upright. "That's for contamination events. Chemical exposure, radiation poisoning, active infectious agents. The human doesn't register for any of those." "Then what did it register her for?" The assistant tilted her head, reading the report 3 times as if repetition would change the words. "Classification, undefined. Threat assessment, incalculable. Recommended action, isolation pending manual evaluation." Val stared at the screen, then at the human visible through the reinforced observation window standing calmly with her arms crossed, then back at the screen. "Incalculable," he repeated. "The system calculated threat indices for a Croth war form last month. Those things have acid blood and can bite through hull plating." "Yes, Coordinator. This is a human." He pulled up the preliminary xenobiological report Earth had submitted. Average bone density lower than galactic standard. Lacks redundant organ systems. Requires narrow temperature and pressure tolerances. He scrolled further. Their own planet tries to kill them with weather patterns. Through the observation window, T247 had begun doing stretches while waiting. "She's not even concerned," Val murmured. His assistant's neck frill went pale. "Should we evacuate the wing?" "For what? A technical error?" Val's pride stung. The Trilluminate Defense Academy had a reputation spanning 8 sectors. "Contact Weapons Master Krell. Tell him we need a manual assessment." Weapons Master Krell entered the observation tower with the fluid confidence of someone who'd forgotten what self-doubt felt like. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, his armor-plated shoulders broad enough to require angling through standard doorways. "You interrupted my advanced tactics seminar," Krell rumbled. "This had better be worth the disruption." "Scanner malfunction," Val explained. "We need a manual baseline assessment before we can reassign her." Krell's eyes, all 4 of them, tracked to the observation window. He studied T247 for a long moment. She's small. Humans average smaller than galactic median. No visible natural weapons. No defensive plating. Krell's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. Earth gravity is what? 0.97 standard? 0.98? So she's not even adapted for high gravity advantages. Krell picked up a practice staff, testing its weight. "What assessment level?" "Basic defensive. We just need response data for the calibration algorithm." Krell's expression suggested he had opinions about the distinction, but he simply rolled his shoulders, a gesture that looked like tectonic plates shifting, and headed for the chamber access corridor. 5 minutes. Have your algorithms ready? The blast door to Assessment Chamber 7 began its ponderous retraction. T-247 turned to face the opening, her posture relaxed, but her eyes tracking every detail of the Thrace weapons master as he entered. She smiled slightly. "Standard assessment, human," Krell announced, planting the practice staff against the floor. "I'm here to establish your baseline combat readiness. This is instructional, not adversarial. Do you understand?" "Completely," T-247 said. "Good. We'll begin with basic defensive responses. I'll demonstrate attack patterns. You'll show me your blocks and evasions." "Sounds straightforward." Krell nodded, shifting into an instructor's stance, weight distributed, staff held in a teaching grip rather than combat position. Professional, controlled, exactly the way he'd run this same assessment 9,000 times before. "First sequence," he said. "Overhead strike, descending at 45 degrees. Standard response is cross-block with forearm reinforcement." He moved. T-247 moved faster. The practice staff never completed its demonstration arc. Her hand caught his primary wrist, redirected the momentum with a pivot that used his own mass against him. And suddenly Krell's weapon wasn't in his hands anymore. It was in hers. She stood 3 paces back, staff held in a ready position that would have scored full marks in his advanced class. Head tilted slightly. "Still want a lesson?" she asked Dodd in the observation tower. Every alarm on Val's console began screaming at once. The emergency committee convened in 17 minutes. Ambassador Dyer of the Yolton Collective arrived first, her hooved feet clicking against the polished floor with metronomic precision. "Explain why my morning trade negotiations were interrupted for a training exercise gone sideways." "The exercise didn't go sideways," Coordinator Val said. "It went perpendicular to established parameters." "Marvelous. We're speaking in geometric metaphors now." Dyer settled into her seat. "Where's the human?" "Secured training room. Monitored." She requested water and a datapad with our combat curriculum archives. Val hesitated. "We provided both." "Why does that sound ominous?" "Because she's been reading for 90 minutes and taking notes." Dr. Rennick slithered into the chamber next, his serpentine lower body coiling beneath his specialized seat. As the station's senior xenobiologist, he'd signed off on humanity's physiological compatibility with syndicate military service. "I watched the footage 4 times, he said. "I'm still not certain what happened." "I'm certain," rumbled Weapons Master Krell from the doorway. He entered slowly, his secondary right arm hanging in a regeneration sling. "The human took my weapon, evaluated 17 potential strike points on my anatomy, and chose not to use any of them." Dyer's ears pricked forward. "Chose?" I saw her eyes track each vulnerability. Joints, sensory organs, nerve clusters. She cataloged them in under 2 seconds and decided I wasn't worth hitting. Krell's mandibles clicked with something that wasn't quite embarrassment. I've trained champions who couldn't read an opponent that thoroughly in a full sparring match. Let's establish facts before we descend into speculation. Rennick pulled up a holographic display showing T-247's biological scan in rotating detail. Human physiology. Endoskeletal structure with minimal calcium density compared to high-gravity species. No natural armor, no venom production, no redundant cardiovascular systems. He highlighted several areas in pulsing red. However, and this is where our preliminary assessments may have been incomplete, their neural architecture is fascinating. Fascinating usually means dangerous in academic speak, Dyer observed. Dangerous is your interpretation. I'd say unpredictable. Rennick expanded the cranial structure. Human brains dedicate extraordinary processing power to pattern recognition and predictive modeling. They don't just react to stimuli. They're constantly running probability scenarios based on incomplete information. Every species with functional cognition does that, Val protested. Not at this speed. Not with this degree of parallel processing. Rennick pulled up comparative scans. A Thrace warrior like Krell sees an attack and responds with trained muscle memory. Efficient, reliable. A human sees an attack and simultaneously processes 17 possible responses, predicts 12. Likely follow-up strikes, and calculates the optimal counterall before the initial strike lands. Val's crest twitched. That's biologically implausible. Their neural transmission speed is 30% faster than galactic median. Their reaction time benefits from an adrenal response system that's frankly excessive for anything except an extinction-level threat environment. Rennick closed the hologram. Earth didn't just produce persistence predators. It produced something that survived by outthinking threats they couldn't outmuscle. They're still fragile, Dyer interjected. Break a human bone, and they're compromised for weeks. True, but consider what it means to evolve intelligence as your primary survival mechanism on a planet actively hostile to your existence. Rennick's tongue flicked out in dark amusement. Humans don't have armor plating, so they invented armor. They can't fly, so they built aircraft. Their bite force is pathetic, so they created weapons that can crack planets. Krell shifted in his seat. She didn't just disarm me. She placed herself at optimal distance for a dozen different weapon types we don't use. Sword range, staff extensions, projectile fallback positions. His eyes narrowed. I've never encountered those stances in our curriculum. Did you ask her where she learned them? She said her homeworld had approximately 1,800 distinct martial traditions before they achieved space travel, and she'd studied 6 of them recreationally. Krell's mandibles spread in what might have been respect or horror. Recreationally. They ran her through 6 more scenarios over the next 3 hours. Each time, T-247 did something that made perfect sense in retrospect, and no sense whatsoever in the moment. She used a smoke grenade not for cover, but to force instructor Vess's superior olfactory senses to rely on sight, evening their sensory advantages. She weaponized the room's environmental controls, flooding a combat zone with water to compromise Instructor Holmes' traction while she moved through. It like she'd grown up swimming in. The 6th scenario escort protection with simulated civilian casualties. She did something neither instructor expected. She talked. You're telegraphing your strikes by shifting weight to your primary leg 2 seconds before you commit, she told Hall, blocking his practice strike almost casually. Your species probably doesn't notice because you're all built the same way, but it's exploitable. Vess, your approach pattern assumes targets will panic and run. Works great on prey species. Doesn't work on anything that recognizes the sound of your claw extension as a pre-attack tell. She was teaching them while defending against them. You're supposed to be completing the objective. Vess hissed, frustrated. I am. The objective is protecting the civilian. T-247 gestured toward the holographic projection. But you two keep trying the same approaches. I'm just providing feedback so we can make this interesting. Holm lowered his maul, breathing heavily. You're coaching us during assessment combat. Is that against the rules? Nobody mentioned rules. The human's expression was genuinely curious. I figured if we're testing response patterns, might as well optimize everybody's performance. Collaborative learning and all that. In the observation room, Coordinator Val had stopped taking notes 20 minutes ago. She's analyzing their techniques while defending against them, Rennick murmured. Simultaneously, Dyer said, though she sounded like she was trying to convince herself. Watch her eyes, Krell said quietly. She's tracking joint articulation, muscle engagement, breathing patterns. She's reverse engineering their entire combat methodology in real time. Vess finally called a halt. She stood with her claws fully extended, breathing hard. Enough. We're not learning anything except that our standard assessment protocols are inadequate. I could have told you that before we started, T247 said. She wasn't even winded. Your scenarios assume opponents operate on threat response instincts. Fight or flight. Predator or prey. She picked up her datapad. Humans don't really do that. We do cost-benefit analysis under stress. Every situation gets evaluated for optimal outcomes. And fighting is usually suboptimal. You disarmed Weapons Master Krell in 3 seconds. Because he was teaching wrong and needed correcting. Not because he was threatening. The distinction seemed obvious to her. If I wanted to hurt him, I wouldn't have taken his weapon. I'd have let him keep it and used the leverage against him. Holm and Vess exchanged glances that contained entire conversations. What did you write in your notes? Holm asked finally. T247 turned the datapad around, showing pages of detailed annotations. Observe combat styles from 17 species in your archives. Cross-referenced with physiological data. Identified pattern dependencies and predictable responses. Drafted some counter-technique proposals. She scrolled through pages of diagrams. You've got solid fundamentals, but everything assumes physical advantage determines outcomes. Nobody's accounting for opponents who think laterally. Laterally? Vess repeated. Sideways. Around problems instead of through them. Humans are really good at sideways. T247 set down the datapad. We spend most of our evolution being outmatched by everything with fangs or claws. We got creative or we got extinct. Creativity won. The footage had been looping for 6 hours in the committee room. Not because anyone needed to see it again. They'd all memorized every frame by the 3rd viewing. It looped because stopping it meant making decisions. Freeze there, Ambassador Dyer said, pointing at the holographic display where T247 was mid-motion during the 4th scenario. Look at her expression. Coordinator Val enhanced the image. The human's face showed concentration, but also something else. Her eyes tracked 3 separate threat vectors, while her body committed to a 4th action entirely. She's bored, Dyer concluded. No, Dr. Rennick said. She's understimulated. There's a difference. Boredom is passive. This is active frustration with environmental limitations. You're saying our entire training facility frustrates her. I'm saying her neural architecture processes threat assessment faster than we can generate meaningful challenges. By the time Vess and Holm executed their attacks, she'd already calculated their outcomes and moved on to evaluating the next 17 possibilities. Rennick gestured at the frozen image. We're not testing her. We're moving in slow motion from her perspective. Weapons Master Krell had been silent since entering. Now he spoke, his voice carrying weight. I watched her teach Holm a counter-grapple technique from Earth called Judo. Do you know what Judo translates to in their language? Gentle way. His mandibles clicked with bitter amusement. Their word for a combat system, designed to use an opponent's strength against them, is gentle. That tells you everything about how humans conceptualize violence. As a tool, Val said slowly, understanding crystallizing. Not as an expression of dominance or territorial defense. As a problem-solving mechanism. Worse, Krell said. As an educational opportunity. The door chimed. Instructor Vess entered without waiting for acknowledgement. Behind her, T247 followed. Looking distinctly less like a recruit under evaluation and more like someone attending. A meeting she'd been expecting for hours. She has a proposal, Vess announced. You're going to hate it, love it, or possibly both simultaneously. T247 nodded greetings around the room. You've been trying to figure out where I fit in your training structure. I don't think I do. Bold opening, Dyer observed. Efficient opening. You've got 900 recruits currently enrolled across multiple species, each following curriculum paths designed around their physiological and cultural baselines. The human pulled up a datapad. Your success rate is exceptional because the system works for what it was built to assess. Traditional combat capability, strength metrics, speed optimization, weapons proficiency. And you're suggesting what exactly? Val asked. That you let me develop a supplementary program. Not replacement, supplementary. Focused on what happens when traditional advantages don't apply. 247 expanded her datapad display into a holographic outline that looked disturbingly well developed. Asymmetric engagement training. Teaching species how to fight opponents who don't match their expected parameters. You want to teach our instructors, Krell said. It wasn't a question. I want to teach anyone interested in learning how to think around problems instead of through them. Your instructors would benefit most immediately, but the principles apply across specializations. She scrolled through sections labeled with terms like environmental weaponization, predictive modeling under incomplete information, and collaborative threat neutralization. Humans spent our entire evolutionary history being the physically inferior option in almost every encounter. We survived by getting creative. That's teachable. Silence filled the observation room like pressure before a hull breach. You've been here less than a standard day, Dyer said carefully. And you're proposing curriculum redesign. I'm proposing curriculum expansion. Your existing programs are solid for what they do. They just don't account for what happens when the rulebook gets thrown out. 247's expression remained earnest. Every species in this academy comes from an evolutionary background where their natural advantages mattered. Humans don't have that luxury. We had to learn to make everything matter. That perspective is valuable. Rennick's coils shifted in intellectual satisfaction. She's not wrong. We've built military doctrine around optimizing existing strengths. We've never had a species whose primary survival mechanism was optimization itself. This is absurd, Val protested, though his conviction sounded thin. She's a recruit, unproven, uncredentialed by our standards. She disarmed your senior weapons master, completed assessment scenarios in fractions of expected timeframes, and identified tactical deficiencies in combat methodologies refined over centuries. Dyer's ears swiveled toward T-247 with something approaching respect. At what point do credentials matter less than demonstrated competence? Krell stood slowly, his massive frame making the observation room feel suddenly smaller. He walked to where T-247 stood, looking down at her from his considerable height advantage. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Krell extended his primary hand in the syndicate gesture of professional acknowledgement. I accept your proposal, he rumbled, on one condition. Name it. You submit to full combat evaluation with me. No assessment protocols. No instructional limitations. Actual engagement. His mandibles spread in what might have been a smile. I want to know what you're capable of when you're not being gentle. T-247 considered this, her expression cycling through several calculations before settling on something that looked almost apologetic. You're going to need better medical coverage for this facility, she said finally. That's not a no. That's a logistics concern. There's a difference. She met his gaze without flinching. But yes, I accept your condition. Val felt his crest through something it had never done before flatten in resignation and elevate in anticipation simultaneously. This is either the best decision we've made this cycle, he said, or the one that gets us all reassigned to cargo inspection duty on the rim. Possibly both. Rennick agreed cheerfully. The committee dispersed, making arrangements and filing reports that would ripple through syndicate military channels for months. T-247 remained in the observation room, reviewing her proposed curriculum outline with focused intensity. Krell stayed as well, watching her work. "Can I ask you something?" he said finally. "Of course. The scanner. When it locked down, you weren't surprised." 247 looked up from her datapad, her expression shifting to something that might have been sympathy. "No, I wasn't. Why?" "Because I've seen that reaction before. Different systems, different contexts, but the same fundamental response." She set down the datapad. "Happens every time someone tries to measure human behavior using predetermined categories. We don't fit them. Not because we're superior, we're not, but because we optimized for variability instead of specialization. Your scanner tried to predict what I'd do. Realized the answer was anything, and couldn't process that as a valid response category. Incalculable." Krell quoted from the error report. "Incalculable," she agreed. "The galaxy spent centuries developing sophisticated systems to identify threats, measuring strength, speed, venom potency, natural weapons, all the variables that matter when biology determines capability." Her smile carried no smugness, only the weariness of someone explaining something obvious that everyone kept missing. Humans divorced capability from biology the moment we picked up our first tool. We've been incalculable ever since. Krell's mandibles clicked slowly. That's what the scanner detected. Not danger, unpredictability. And unpredictability in a system designed around prediction looks exactly like a malfunction. T-247 picked up her datapad again, returning to her curriculum notes. Good news is, unpredictability is teachable. Bad news is, it requires accepting that sometimes the best answer to what should I do is something nobody expects, including yourself. She pulled up a section labeled Improvisation Under Pressure and began adding notations. Humans don't plan for every contingency. We plan for the ability to adapt to contingencies we haven't imagined yet. It's inefficient, chaotic, and absolutely maddening for anyone trying to model our behavior. But it works. She glanced around the observation room, at the academy beyond, at the vast institutional infrastructure of a multi-species military alliance that had existed longer than human civilization. You build all this on the assumption that biology determines destiny. We're the proof that sometimes stubbornness and improvisation trump predetermination. Krell rumbled something that might have been agreement or might have been a prayer for patience. Your first class starts next cycle. I expect documentation, lesson plans, and safety protocols. You'll have them. T-247 stood, collecting her datapad. And Krell? Thank you. For what? For not assuming the scanner was right just because it was sophisticated. Sometimes the most advanced systems fail, not because they're broken, but because they encountered something they weren't designed to measure. She left, her footsteps fading down the corridor with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where. She was going, and approximately 17 backup routes. If that path proved blocked, Krell stood alone in the observation room, staring at the frozen holographic image of T-247 mid-motion, her expression showing that characteristic disconnect between commitment and calculation. Incalculable. The scanner hadn't identified a threat level. It had identified the absence of a reliable prediction framework. Not because humans were dangerous, but because danger implied consistent parameters. Strengths to measure, weaknesses to exploit, behaviors to anticipate. Humans didn't offer consistent parameters. They offered infinite variables. Wearing a friendly smile and asking if you still wanted that lesson, Krell's mandibles spread in genuine amusement for the first time in years. The galaxy had spent millennia cataloging threats among the stars, building elaborate systems to identify and classify every possible danger. They'd measured bite force, analyzed venom composition, calculated atmospheric tolerances and gravitational advantages. Nobody had thought to build a scanner that could measure what happened when a species made adaptation itself the only constant. He suspected they'd be building one soon, right after they expanded the medical wing. 3 months later, T247's Asymmetric engagement program had enrolled 214 students across 11 species. Her classes ran at maximum capacity, with waiting lists extending into the next training cycle. The curriculum she'd proposed that first day had evolved into something far more comprehensive, a fundamental rethinking of how the syndicate approached combat doctrine, tactical planning, and strategic assessment. But more importantly, it had changed how they thought about humanity itself, not as newcomers to be accommodated, not as fragile recruits to be carefully managed, but as the species that had looked at an indifferent universe, filled with things stronger, faster, and better armed than themselves, and decided that being none of those things wasn't actually a problem. It was just another variable to optimize around. In the observation tower overlooking Training Chamber 7, Coordinator Val watched T247 demonstrate something she called environmental reading to a class of mixed species recruits. She moved through the space like water, finding cracks, turning obstacles into advantages, transforming limitations into opportunities. The scanner never did recalibrate properly for humans. His assistant observed. Val's crest elevated in what his species expressed as contentment. "No," he agreed, "and I don't think it ever will. Because you couldn't calculate hope. You couldn't measure the variable that made humans look at impossible situations and see only problems waiting to be solved. You couldn't quantify the stubborn refusal to accept that biology was destiny. The scanner had been right all along. Humans were incalculable, not because they were threats, but because they were something the galaxy had never encountered before, a species that had evolved past the limitations of evolution itself, that had looked at the constraints of flesh and bone and said, "Watch us work around that." And they had. They always would. In the training chamber below, T247 finished her demonstration and smiled at her students. 17 different species, each with their own natural advantages, each now learning to think like the one species that had never had any advantages except the refusal to accept disadvantage as permanent. "Remember," she told them, her voice carrying clearly through the observation speakers, "the question isn't whether you can win. The question is whether you've imagined enough ways to try." Somewhere in the Academy's main computer core, the biometric scanner processed another human recruit. It hummed. It analyzed. It calculated. And then, as it had learned to do over the past 3 months, it simply marked the file with a single notation: human, parameters, variable, recommendation, adapt. The blast doors stayed open. The alarms stayed silent. And humanity kept teaching the galaxy what it meant when survival wasn't about being the strongest. It was about being the most impossible to predict. The end.